So, Richie, thanks for joining the podcast today. It's great to chat to you again, man.
Thanks for having me on, Adam. Absolutely honoured to come on board and speak with you.
Yeah, great, man. It's been a while since we've met, and I don't know if people can understand your accents, but you're a fellow Irishman, but you're not based in Ireland, right? So let us know kind of what you're doing, where you are, and you know a little bit about yourself for those who don't know about you.
Absolutely. Fellow Irishman indeed. And if you can't understand it at this point, guys, the accent's not going to get any better. I'm actually based in Liverpool at the moment. To kind of give you a bit of background, I got into nutrition originally, for the same old reasons that everybody gets into it. I used to be overweight when I was younger. Got into nutrition, got into exercise back then, and I decided not to do nutrition in university, even though I was a big science geek, because my parents didn't think it was that much of a viable career option, which kind of that ages me considerably when you think about what era I'm speaking about. So I got into general science, did a degree in general science, went around traveling after I graduated for a while, traveling and working. But nutrition is always something that I absolutely loved. So I decided I wanted to do it full time. It's just something I can talk about forever. So went back, did a master's in Barcelona for a year, set up my business, started working as an online coach. And I also realized that I just love nutrition so much that I wanted to get more into academia. So now I'm doing my PhD in Liverpool, John Moores University. And I'm doing my PhD research in the area of so there's a lot of different things involved, but it's body composition, specifically muscle mass, and sarcopenia, which is muscle loss, and how that relates to cardiac risk factors, so cardiovascular disease, diabetes, in a specific population. So I work with cardiac rehab populations, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about that during the podcast. But that's kind of like a general overview of where I'm from and what I do.
Yeah, thanks for that, man. And I think, I don't know why I got interested in nutrition as well. I don't think I was, like you alluded to, that everybody got into it because they were fat when they're younger.
My apologies. Big sweeping statements, shouldn't make those.
Everybody in nutrition that gets into it were fat when they were kids. I can quote you on that. Now, I can't remember why, but I did take a kind of similar approach to it as well. When I was trying to do, we have a bit of a unique situation in Ireland, and I know there's like a lot of like people listening from outside of Ireland and the UK as well. But in Ireland and the UK, you have this unique situation where you actually have to know what you want to do when you're 18, straight from like secondary, high school, and you have to commit to that. So if you want to do financial, I don't know, investing, or if you want to be a mechanical engineer, you have to know that at 18 and then just do that. Whereas in the US, you can obviously spend a lot more money and get yourself into a lot more debt. But one upside to that is you get to do a lot of random subjects for the first year and then kind of, get your feet wet, so to speak, and then pick what you want to do. So I was the same as yourself. When you're 18, like the first thing you want to do is like get out of the house of mom and dad and get money. So you're like, what can I get a job in, make money? And I did the same thing. I think I wanted to do dietetics, which was in a Trinity College, which is, most people in Ireland would have heard that. But I think it was really high points, and I wasn't like really bad in school. Like it was maybe a B plus, A minus student, but you need to be like A plus and everything student to get into that course. Because for some reason I thought that if you didn't have dietetics and you went to the other college that offered nutrition in Dublin, at least, that you weren't a dietitian or a nutritionist, that was bad, because that's what you know when you're 18, right? You don't really know much about qualifications. So I didn't get into that because it was pretty high. So defaulted to my second choice, which was like business languages. What did you actually do as your undergraduate degree?
So my undergrad was biological sciences. I did that at UCC, University College Cork, and I specialised in microbiology.
Oh, okay. It's really hard, that topic. Haven't gone back and going.
It's super interesting. Like looking back on it, it's super cool when I think about like all the stuff that you can do with it. But it wasn't where my passions lie. You did business and languages. What languages did you do?
I did French, actually, just French. So
Okay, cool.
The only reason I did that was because you had a better chance, or it was an obvious chance of going abroad to do an Erasmus, which is basically a year to just party and not do a whole lot. Whereas if you just did a normal degree, so to speak, without the language, you had to be good at your class, or you had to get good grades. So at least I knew that I was guaranteed to go abroad and spend the extra year just to. I don't know, it was worth it. I mean, but not much use, to be honest, anymore, other than being able to speak a little bit of French if I go to France, which I rarely do, and they always speak English anyway. But yeah, I'm doing
God,
the
what parts
masters
of
as well.
France are you going to?
Yeah, I actually don't really like France, to be honest. I wouldn't want to live there. Nice weather, but I prefer to live in Spain. I just think it's a more relaxed lifestyle. But yeah, sorry. Tell us a little bit more about what are you specifically doing? I know you talked about, because of the lockdown and stuff, that research is being put on hold. And interesting enough, when I spoke to Peter Fishin a couple of weeks ago, he mentioned that, like, he's real into big bodybuilding as well. He's a pro bodybuilder and a coach. But he said, like, oh, when we're doing research, we had to do like I think his was something to do with kidney disease and hypertrophy, because like nobody's going to fund a study on how somebody grows their biceps from 17 to 17 and a half inches. I actually wonder where Brad Schoenfield gets all his money for his research, unless he's running some cartel or something. But it's pretty interesting.
See,
So tell us.
I don't think Brad, and like I could be wrong, and like it's dangerous saying this on a podcast, but I don't think Brad has to look for a huge amount of the funding himself, because I know he works with a lot of collaborators on projects. So I'm sure that they probably put in a lot of the legwork, and they get Brad on board for his expertise in the area, which is the ideal, which every kind of like academic is looking for. You want to build up your position in life to get to a position where other people come and say to you, hey,
Yeah,
come work with us. We'll do
that's
the work. And
that's true, actually. And not that I have no idea how his kind of research works, but I've heard, and maybe not even in this field, but in other fields, that someone that's quite prolific or well known, they will like be put on certain papers, and vice versa. And I'm not saying that that's what they do, but yeah, you actually make a lot of sense there, where they'll be brought in to oversee something or to give some help, but not like me starting PhD next week and then trying to do a study. So tell us, like, what's that like for you? Do you have to get all your funding yourself, and what specifically are you kind of researching into? I know you mentioned about like sarcopenia. It would actually be good if you could explain that. I don't want to take for granted everybody knows what that actually means.
Absolutely, yeah. So yeah, it's I was very, very lucky when I was looking for a PhD. I happened to find one that was it just ticked so many boxes when it comes to my own interests. So when I found my PhD, the original title was something along the lines of a high protein Mediterranean diet and resistance exercise for the amelioration of cardiometabolic risk markers in cardiac rehab, which is it just rolls off the tongue. Really, really catchy title. So what we're looking at is we work with people in cardiac rehab. And just for anybody who doesn't know, if you have a heart attack, or if you have some sort of a cardiac event, or if you're at a high risk of a cardiac event, you'll often get sent to cardiac rehab. And it's usually an exercise program that will have some advice about diet and nutrition. And it's basically a lifestyle program that is there to help people get exercising, improve their diet, and hopefully reduce their risk factors for cardiovascular disease. So things like reduce their blood lipids, like their regular cholesterol, reduce triglycerides, reduce their blood sugar, things like that. And the thing with that type of program is it's very, very aerobic exercise based. So it focuses a lot on jogging and walking and like rowing machines and stuff like that. And what we think is that, so I suppose to give a little bit of background, in cardiovascular disease, there's something called the obesity paradox. And the obesity paradox shows that at people who have a higher body mass index, so a higher BMI, tend to have a lower mortality rate. So they don't die as easily as people who have a lower BMI. So that doesn't kind of make sense. So we think somebody with a higher BMI, they're probably somebody who's a little bit they've got a higher adiposity compared to somebody with a lower BMI. So we would automatically think that the person with higher adiposity is going to, be more at risk of a heart attack and dying from a heart attack. But it's actually the inverse is true, that people with a lower BMI actually tend to have a higher mortality rate. And that's the obesity paradox. The problem with BMI, as you'll know yourself, is that it gives us a very, very rough indication of somebody's body composition. It doesn't really tell us how much muscle they have or how much fat they have. So what we think is that people who have a higher BMI within that cardiovascular population, they've actually got a higher muscle mass. Obviously, they're going to have a high fat mass as well compared to the lower BMI. And that lower BMI is actually going to still have a high fat mass, but will have a lower muscle mass, so their body weight is lower. And we think that lower body mass puts them at a greater risk of cardiovascular events, so heart attacks and things like that. And the reason for that loss of muscle is a thing called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia is kind of like the core, one of the core elements of my PhD. And for anybody who might not be familiar with it, sarcopenia is the age-associated loss of muscle mass and muscle function as well. And to give people a bit of an idea, basically from your 30s onwards, and we think it starts as early as your 30s, it's usually around your 40s, people start losing muscle. So much so that, if there have been some studies that have shown that, people between their 20s and their 80s, they can lose up to 40% of their muscle mass, which is a huge amount of muscle. But if you think about it, when we consider older people, we often look at them as being a lot, frailer and smaller, and that's because they lose a lot of muscle mass. And so my research, what we want to do is we want to see if we can change that muscle mass through resistance exercise and through diet, can we improve their cardiovascular risk markers? So, again, their cholesterol, their blood sugar, things like that. And can we reduce, and eventually, obviously, we want to find out if we can reduce the risk of somebody having some sort of a health condition. And obviously, we've got a resistance exercise strategy, and we've got a certain diet strategy that, hopefully we'll get a chance to speak about today as well.
That's really interesting. A few points to mention there. I remember on the BMI thing, I guess when they look at the BMI, there's probably two groups of people with a high BMI: the people who are, low lean body mass, or let's say low lean or low muscle mass but high body fat, and then people who are probably higher body fat but also higher lean body mass as well. And I don't know if the research has separated those two and said one's a higher risk category. Well, someone who's actually a higher body mass but has similar amount of lean body mass is someone who's lower BMI but have similar lean body mass because one's leaner. Are they more susceptible to cardiovascular risk events versus someone who's like, let's say, quite high BMI but actually they've got quite a bit of muscle mass because they're, let's not say bodybuilders, but they're active. Maybe they do sports or they do some sort of weight training or have done at least some point in their life and need a good quality diet.
So yeah, there is a bit of research on that area specifically, and it's been done quite simply up until now, and there's obviously a lot more research out there, but there have been studies that have looked at, do we have, if we can compare people who have low fat mass and low muscle mass with people with high fat mass, low muscle mass, then high muscle mass, low fat mass, and high muscle mass, high fat mass. And funnily enough, or not surprisingly, the people with the high muscle mass and low fat mass are actually the healthiest individuals. They got the lowest rates of cardiovascular events, whereas those with the lowest amounts of muscle mass tend to have higher rates of cardiovascular events. And there's a lot of reasons for that, because of how muscle works and because of what that says about somebody, because obviously muscle is related to somebody's diet, like you mentioned in the past. It's also related to their activity levels, and that can have a huge effect on cardiovascular health too.
Yeah, one thing I find funny is that when people try to confirm their biases, especially bodybuilders, and promote muscle building for health, they'll say, being more muscular is healthier, as if it's a linear kind of scale where it's like you're 120 kilos of muscle mass, which is not even physiologically possible without super physiological doses of testosterone, but yet getting more muscular is going to be more healthy. But when we talk about being more muscular or having more lean body mass is healthier, it's to a point where it probably has a a very big drop off. Getting to like being, everyone doesn't need to become a bodybuilder, right? You don't need to become a bodybuilder to get the health benefits. You just have to probably have some level of lean body mass. But another thing you mentioned, which was quite funny, was after I did one of my shows, bodybuilding shows last year, in Dublin, in Cork. I went to the NHS Expo in London. I think it was in Manchester or London. I can't remember. Like about 2 days later, and I didn't stay on a bodybuilding diet, or it wasn't staying in a calorie deficit for those 2 days. But like, I didn't need that like a pig either. But I got on one of these like machines at the expo that like the guy was explaining to me whatever. I don't know if he's a clinician or just probably a tech sales guy, but he's saying that it's worth a couple of grand. They're very accurate. And my BMI was like really high, and he's like, you probably need to lose a little bit of weight. And it was like I was literally probably 5 or 6% body fat, because I got DEXA scan a few weeks before and I had got leaner. So it's pretty funny how like the BMI can get messed up. But there's not many people who are walking around with a lot of body mass, lean body mass.
It's a really, really good point. Like people hate on BMI, and there are plenty of reasons to hate on it. Like that thing I mentioned earlier, the obesity paradox, that only exists if you measure people's body composition with BMI. Okay, that only exists within the BMI spectrum. But so like you have to think that why do we use BMI? And it's because it's super easy to measure. It's like it's basically somebody's height and weight. It's an easy thing to measure, and it does give us really, really good information, because we can look at our population, and we can look at our population over time and say, okay, there has been a steady increase in BMI over time. And people might say to you, oh man, but like that doesn't tell us anything about muscle mass. God, like, there's people like, if I'm going to ask you, if you look at the general population and you see that BMI going up over time, are you going to say, oh, well, maybe the majority of those people are just really jacked and really, really big? That's not the case. Like the general population, that increase in BMI is being stimulated by, an increase in adiposity. People are gaining weight, gaining body fat over time. So if we're looking on population levels, it's great. But if we want to kind of look at the individual, yes, we do need to look at other factors. BMI isn't the best tool, but it is a tool nonetheless that we have to kind of, we have to be aware of its limitations and of its benefits as well.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, I was kind of like that before, like a couple of years ago when I suppose I first started educating myself, or I started learning a bit more about BMI and maybe some of the limitations of it, and painting everyone with the same brushes. If everyone's some like athlete or something like that, everyone plays rugby. Like it's probably a percentage of 1% of people who actually are it's not going to apply for, because they have too much muscle mass. And most people, and they're probably like, guys in their early 20s or teenagers or something like that. Whereas for everybody else, you just go outside and walk around. Like I live in Dublin here, you walk around, you'll just see, it's pretty much applicable for everybody, everybody. So you mentioned something about the sarcopenia, or at least muscle loss coming on as early as your 30s, and that would scare a lot of people. I mean, so I've got 2 more years or a year and a half, and then I'm pretty screwed. I'm just gonna, and I better,
still a baby, you're grand.
I should give up my bodybuilding now. I'm just going to get worse from the age of 30 on. But no, in reality, is that something that we actually see? Is this in just general population of people who are inactive, who don't eat enough protein? Guys who are, say, older, maybe say they're in their late 20s or early 30s, and they're getting into, say, lifting, and they're often concerned about hearing about this muscle loss. And, it sounds quite scary that, well, what's the point in even trying if I can't make any gains? Or am I going to just start looking worse now because I'm in my 30s? I'm going to start losing muscle mass? What are your thoughts on that? Or is what you said, does that apply to everybody, or is that just apply to people who are just, generally physically inactive? Or is this something that we really, can we stave it off? Can we push it out without the use of like testosterone replacement therapy? It would be good to hear your opinion on that as well. When you mentioned about these elderly people who are like, who need more muscle mass to kind of to ameliorate some of these cardiovascular risks, I was thinking like, what if you just gave them some testosterone? Like, they gain pretty muscle pretty fast in terms of trying to get an old person to lift weights. And I know there's some pretty significant gains they can make if someone's a new lifter, even over the age of 75. I was reading recently the new study, funnily enough, by Brad Schoenfeld, plus probably many others. But yeah, what are your thoughts? I kind of rambled there for a bit.
No, so yeah, like it's a really, really relevant question. I'll talk to the first point first. Bring me back onto the testosterone at the end in case I forget to get to it. So with sarcopenia, that it's really, really important to consider those things that you mentioned. Is it just in the general population? And yeah, when we look at sarcopenia, we have to talk about the general population. And if we ask, I suppose an important question to ask is, why does sarcopenia happen in the first place? And there's a number of reasons for it. And I will say that the principal reason for sarcopenia, and it's probably one of the most important factors to consider when we're trying to counter the effects of sarcopenia, is people become less active the older they become. So if we think about it, physical activity, it probably for some people it peaks in their when they're children, and from there on it just goes downhill. But people become less active as we get older. Like I know myself, I in the university, or at home now at the moment, working from home, I spend the majority of my time sat down in front of a computer, doing work from there. And
you're losing muscle mass as we're speaking right now.
Exactly. I think the fact that people spend so much time sitting down, and this is another conversation, it's detrimental to health. But people become less active. When people get older, when they retire, you're told when you're retired, it's time to relax, take a load off. As people get older, and we know that from our 50s, sarcopenia speeds up a lot. When people get older, they just do less. They don't walk around as much. They don't do as much structured exercise. They don't carry their groceries as much. People become less active. And when people become less active, there's no stimulus on the muscle. And we all know, or at least everybody who's listening to this podcast will be familiar with the fact that the stimulus for muscle growth comes from our exercise. The exercise that we do, that stimulates muscle growth. And everything that we do on top of that, taking supplements, getting enough protein, that's all complementary to that process. That helps augment that process. But the original stimulus comes from muscle. So if we take away that original stimulus, that's why the body's like, okay, what am I holding onto all this muscle for? There's no need for it. We start to lose it over time. And there's other problems that come along with age as well. So one, when we get older, we know that there's an increase in levels of inflammation and inflammatory cytokines in the body. We know that increases in certain inflammatory cytokines within the blood, that they can actually reduce the hypertrophic response in the body. We know that as we get older, we don't digest protein as well. So we don't absorb as many amino acids. So we actually need to eat more protein to stimulate a muscle protein synthesis. We know that hormonal factors change as we get older. We know testosterone starts decreasing about 1% per year from our 30s onwards. So there's a lot of factors that come together, and they can contribute to something that we call anabolic resistance. And what that means is basically when we try to stimulate muscle growth, we need a greater stimulus the older we get to stimulate the same amount of muscle growth. And that happens in two forms. It happens in the amount of exercise that we need and the amount of protein that we need. So as we get older, there has been research done that has shown that older people need more intense or higher volumes of exercise to stimulate significant muscle protein synthesis. And the same goes for their protein intake. We know that, for example, young people can probably stimulate protein maximally with 20 grams of whey protein. And with older people, it may be close to double that. So close to 40 grams of whey protein to stimulate muscle growth. So these are major factors that contribute to that loss of muscle over time. And like hopefully we'll have time to speak about some of the countermeasures for that. But people might say, okay, look, if I'm older, it doesn't matter if I lose muscle, okay, so what? I'm not going to look as jacked at the beach when I'm 70 years old. That's a legitimate concern. You might be worried about that. But the big thing is that it's not just a loss in muscle mass. We know that sarcopenia is associated with an even greater loss of muscle function, and that's muscle strength, and that's called dynapenia, and it's something people don't speak about a lot. But dynapenia is the loss of muscle strength and function as we get older. And that has a huge amount of effects on our life. So for example, and I'm going to talk about this, and I know a lot of your listeners are younger bodybuilder guys, and this doesn't, they think, none of this matters to me. Think of it like this. When you get older, if you lose muscle function and you get to the point where you can't walk up a stairs without assistance, or you can't get out of bed without assistance, or you're not able to bring your groceries home, or you're not able to put, like a heavy cans of whatever beans into the highest shelf in your fridge or something like that. When you lose that freedom of motion, when you lose that muscle function, it has major effects on your life. We also know that the loss of muscle has major effects on cardiovascular health. So people with sarcopenia tend to have higher risk of cardiovascular disease. They've got higher levels of diabetes, because when you think about it, muscle is the biggest dump or sink for glucose in our body. And if your muscle is smaller and inactive and less quality, you're not going to be able to dispose of glucose as easily. We know it's associated with mental decline. So with cognitive decline, it's associated with depression, which is probably because, like, if you feel like you're unhealthy and you're not able to do all the things you're normally able to do, you're not able to go out and see your friends, you're going to get depressed. It's associated with osteoporosis. There are a huge amount of conditions associated with this, with muscle loss. And that's why it's incredibly serious. But I also think that it's something that is very, very easily remedied as well. And we'll get to that. But I've just remembered that you did mention something on testosterone. And testosterone, or actually anabolic steroids, were originally invented to help prevent muscle loss.
That's right. It was Dianabol, I think, or something like that, right? Was it?
Exactly. Yeah. One of its original uses was, so if you think of it like this, people lose muscle mass when they're inactive, like I said. And so when are people most inactive? If they're in bed all the time. And when are people in bed all the time? If they're in a nursing home or if they're in hospital. And we know that in nursing homes, the rates of sarcopenia can be as high as 40% plus, because people are just not active at all. And in hospital, we know that people tend to lose a lot of muscle mass very, very easily. Like you can actually lose over a kilo of muscle in a week from just being bedbound in a hospital. So Dianabol, one of its original uses was to help prevent that loss of muscle over time. And testosterone replacement therapy is a valid strategy nowadays to help prevent and reduce sarcopenia in older people. And I think, from my perspective, I think that's an absolutely viable option for people. Like, if I was to say to you, let's just imagine that, we're not in the world of bodybuilding, we're not in the world of powerlifting. And I said, okay, you've got a medical condition. The only way to treat it is by giving you a certain hormone. Okay, so actually, let's talk about thyroid. Say you've got hypothyroidism. Your thyroid levels are low. So we're going to supply some of the T3 hormone to you. That seems reasonable, right? Because we're giving you something you're deficient in to help preserve your health. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah, no, it does, absolutely.
Yeah, so with testosterone, it's the same way. The only thing is, now within certain populations, if you say testosterone, it's like, oh no, I'm not taking this testosterone. I want to be natty. I'm not going to go on roids or fail a test or something. But for older people, they don't give a damn about being natty. They just want to be able to do what they do normally and live a healthy and a vibrant life. So I think testosterone, if that can help them with that, and there are plenty of studies that show that it can help improve muscle mass in older people and a lot of other improvements in just general health and well-being, I think it's a great option. And like I'll say it like now, if I ever got to a point in my life where my doctor said, yeah, we probably need to put you on testosterone, I'd be like, do it. Yeah, great. I'll just go into a new cycle of bodybuilding and put on all the mass that I never gained when I was a kid,
Trembolone, D-ball.
Everything. Oh, you just put me on everything, Doc.
I've already got them in my drawer. I've been waiting for the day for you to say go. I think I don't know much about the kind of the medical field in terms of what they suggest and stuff, but I've rarely heard of anybody being prescribed testosterone, really, at least in Ireland. I know there's like wellness clinics in the US and stuff. So I don't know if I asked my parents or my grandparents, the ones that are around. If you talked about steroids, they'd probably just think, or testosterone, they'd probably just, they might know what it is. My grandparents might know what it is, but then if they did, they probably just, oh yeah, bodybuilders, like, you know. So I think there's maybe just an education piece in certain countries, and then I don't know how the practices are with doctors as well. And I know that, you know, I'm not sure. I'm sure at some point it will catch on. And I think with younger people, it's probably they're the ones who are saying, you know, I don't want to be a fake natty. I mean, I think more in the elderly people, it's more just an educational piece. And yeah, because, you know, a lot of elderly people take a lot of medication anyway. So, I mean, I don't know what they do for testosterone, if it's like gels or something like that, right? It's not like you don't use injectables, I don't think, at least. But yeah, but going back on, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so like one of the reasons for that kind of lack of education is because I think sarcopenia is only starting to become more spoken about now. It was only officially classified as a disease, I think it was 2017 or 2018. So it's a very, very recent diagnosis. So I don't think doctors considered it to be a major issue previously, which means that it's not something that they would have spoken about. Like, you know, they wouldn't have been told to look out for it, like look out for sarcopenia in older people. If you see signs of it, you know, something needs to be done. So that's why people wouldn't hear about it. But I think we're going to hear more about it now just because of its link with other health factors. Kind of as we move forward, it's going to become more important.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've always said it, even though I compete in natural bodybuilders, I definitely would consider, if I'm older and I felt like, let's say if I'm in my 50s or whatever, and I felt it was actually having an impact. I don't think it probably wouldn't have an impact on me able to put like cans of beans at that age. But maybe me feeling like, I don't know, if you have low testosterone, you can have some low ebbs, or mentally you might feel a bit more blue or depressed. Other functions such as sexual function, etc. Like, I started to feel like it actually had an impact on me. And I've had low testosterone before, because after a bodybuilding comp prep, you do. And when I did my very first one, I was 21, and I didn't know what was wrong with me. I actually had to go to the doctor, and they actually did talk about using testosterone if it didn't come back to normal. But once I figured out that it was what it was, I knew that it would come back, because I had read about, you're actually getting low testosterone after you get really lean, and that it comes back within like 6 months. And lo and behold, a few months later, I was normal again. So not that it doesn't happen to be anymore, but I'm just prepared for it, and I know that it's just a kind of a point in time. But at times I've felt like if I had to feel this way all the time for the rest of my life, like, it wouldn't be great, because you had low energy, but also on top of that, whether it's correlation or causation, you have low mood as well, just not motivated and stuff like that. So yeah, I wouldn't be against it at all when I'm older, but not for superficial reasons, just so I can get like 10 kilos more muscle than I already have. Like, it's not going to make me any happier. But to go back to the point where we talked about the causes of sarcopenia, a few things that you mentioned is people just get a lot more active, and one thing or inactive, and one thing that people kind of have a misconception is that, like, when you hit 30 or something, your metabolism starts to slow down, and that's why you pile on more weight. But in reality, you mentioned some of the factors that, like, well, you just have more kids, you probably have more money to eat out, you don't play sport or anymore, you now work in an office, and when you get home, you just drink some beers and watch TV. And yeah, maybe you could say your metabolism slowed down a bit, but is it really? Like, maybe your non-exercise activity, thermogenesis, is part of your metabolism, but your actual basal metabolic rate isn't slowing down because you're getting older. Maybe when you're like losing muscle, I'm sure it does, but to the extent that people think about it, it's more just, I won't say people giving up, but they're just accepting that I'm getting older now, so this is supposed to happen to me. And it's interesting if we could mitigate, and maybe we'll get into them, mitigate some of those things, because when I get guys who are talking to me that are, say, not old, but like they might be in their 30s, and they're saying, oh, well, I know that like people start losing their muscle mass and stuff as they get older. Like, does that mean I can't build muscle? And it's actually quite promising to hear that it's not biological necessarily factors. It's not nature, but more nurture, or these societal or behavioral type factors that actually are a big cause in muscle loss, that if you had kept up what you were doing, perhaps we would have seen less muscle loss. And yes, you did mention some stuff about muscle protein synthesis, that the more anabolic resistance. I would like to talk more about that at some point, but I'd say it's probably fairly in depth. But when we talk about building muscle or maintaining muscle, we have this muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown, and muscle protein synthesis being stimulated by eating protein, but also the stimulus to the muscle from an external load. And then the breakdown, does that actually increase as we get older as well? So I guess people would think, well, yes, I can stimulate muscle protein synthesis, so building new muscle through lifting and eating protein, etc. But if this muscle protein breakdown is going to be so high when I'm getting older, I'm fighting, I'm pissing in the wind, essentially.
So yeah, that's a really, really good question to ask. So at the moment, there's no consensus on whether muscle protein breakdown increases. More than likely, muscle protein breakdown stays relatively consistent throughout our lives, but the big difference is in muscle protein synthesis. And you know that your levels of muscle mass are determined by that balance between muscle protein breakdown and muscle protein synthesis. So even if muscle protein breakdown is staying relatively consistent over time, if muscle protein synthesis drops, then that's where we have a case where, we're actually going to be losing muscle over time. And that's where we need to consider it. I wouldn't be surprised if some research comes out in the future and says that, there is a slight increase in muscle protein breakdown too, because we do know that there is an increase in inflammatory cytokines as we get older, that there's those reductions in, basically there's kind of a switch to a more catabolic processes as we get older. But yeah, it is a matter of working with the side of the equation that we can, and that's the muscle protein synthesis side of things. And we need to kind of start tackling it from that option. What can we do to increase that MPS over time?
Yeah, so I mean, for people who already lift and eat protein, is there anything that they can do extra, or what are your thoughts on that? And then for people who are just getting into it, or let's say haven't been consistent, but they're starting to think about maybe health. And I know people start to think about their health a bit more when they get over themselves a bit as they get older, and they don't just think about aesthetics. And maybe that's the reason why they're getting into lifting or eating well. I'm kind of focusing on that, not focusing on it, but be a bit more aware of it as they get older as well. Just general health and longevity. So people won't be getting into that way. What kind of advice would you have, or is there anything particular that we need to do or focus on, or is it simply just lift weights? And you mentioned something about volume as well, the volume of training. Does that mean now somebody's doing 20 sets a week has to do 30 sets a week? What are your thoughts there?
There's a lot in that, and they're all really, really relevant points. I suppose the first thing to think about is, okay, what can we do to increase muscle protein synthesis? And one is do resistance exercise, do any kind of exercise really that gets you moving, gets stimulating muscle. But obviously resistance exercise is one of the best for stimulating muscle growth. We know that. So do that. That's one of the best things that you can do. And then on the other side is get plenty of protein in your diet. There's obviously some supplements, and there's some other compounds that we can take into our diet, other nutrients that are beneficial for muscle growth. But protein is by far the best one, and getting it in sufficiently regularly to stimulate muscle growth is important. But let's say we've got two groups of people. We've got the younger people who are let's say, in their 20s or 30s. And then we've got older people that we need to look at. And with the younger people, I would say is just train, get a decent amount of muscle onto your frame. And like you said earlier, that is by no means telling people you need to be a bodybuilder if you want to look after your muscle. Use your muscle. Okay, be somewhat strong. Okay, and I can't be any more specific than that, but be somewhat strong, be able to use your body. Okay, and if you can do that, and if you can maintain your exercise levels over time, you are going to be in a much better position, 20, 30, 40 years down the line than somebody who does absolutely no exercise at all. Okay, so exercise is your friend. Look after yourself now, and you will be in a much better position in the future. Like that, there's nothing radical about that. But for somebody who's older, The same rules apply. Like people think, oh, like if you're dealing with a 70-year-old, you know, it's like, I'm 70 now, there's not much I can do, you know, with all this anabolic resistance. That's not true. We know that there's plenty of studies in people who are in their 80s who are able to put on muscle with resistance exercise over time. Now, none of them are turning into Arnold Schwarzenegger, but like they're all getting bigger. They're all putting on more muscle, and more importantly, they're getting more strength. They're getting stronger, and that's really, really important for them. Because if you can take somebody who had difficulty getting out of bed or walking upstairs, and you know, after 3 or 4 months of training, suddenly they can get out of bed by themselves, or they're able to walk upstairs without assistance, you've just changed that person's life, you know? So the resistance exercise and protein still applies for older people. But the big difference is that with older people, they probably need to do it a little bit more regularly. Like, you know, still, that said, if you can get them doing resistance exercise 2 or 3 times a week, I think that's absolutely fantastic. And if you can get them eating protein, like a big dose of protein in a couple of meals a day, that's fantastic as well. The big thing to think about, though, is with older people, making those kind of lifestyle changes is never easy. So you kind of have to start from where that person is. And, you know, that might be as much as just saying, okay, let's get you walking. Let's start with walking and we'll go from there. Or like, you know, let's do a little bit more gardening or something like that. Or let's walk up the stairs a couple of times every day. Because not everybody's going to want to hop into the gym, especially now with Corona, especially older people. Like they're not going to want to be surrounded by people who are breathing heavy and coughing and spluttering and putting out all of these viral particles everywhere.
Yeah, no, I've definitely seen it firsthand. I got my car fixed the other day, and the mechanic lives beside my grandparents or my granddad. And I remember my granddad had been, ever since I can remember, he's been quite frail. Since I was young, he just seemed old, but I'm sure that's the way it is when you're like 5 and someone's 65 or whatever. But yeah, obviously he's aged the same amount as I have, but he hasn't really like deteriorated at all. And my father, who's a physiotherapist, has been doing some sessions with him. Like, I mean, he's not doing like 5x5 and deadlifts, but like, you know, some squats onto the chair or something like that. And like some very basic exercise, and he's just been able to maintain. And he's always, and the mechanic actually said, I saw your grandfather walking around like the block, you know, and he's, I don't know what age he is now. He's over 80 anyway. But yeah, but then you can see other people who are just actually, in fact, his wife, who died quite a while ago, had like Alzheimer's, and she became very inactive from stopping swimming, and within like a couple of years, she was just in a wheelchair, and then, you know, she died unfortunately because of Alzheimer's. But it just shows the complete opposite. If you know how such a little bit of activity can go a long way. And it's not even like going back to the point where I said bodybuilders saying, oh, you know, increases your strength if you have more muscle and you know, the person saying that advice is like already 120 kilos. But like, you know, grip strength is associated with longevity, and I'm sure that's to do with the muscle mass, because someone who's, or strength, and then muscle mass, because someone who can't grip won't have much muscle. But it doesn't mean that you have to be an IPF world's, you know, over 90 kilo top 10. It's just, there's a point where it just, you know, okay, after this point, this information really only applies to general population, not to people who are trying to increase their grip strength that can hold 400 kilos instead of 300.
Yeah, it's the law of diminishing returns. Like I think a lot of people, and this happens, you know, very, very easily when they start out in the world of nutrition or fitness. Everybody wants to kind of put people onto their favorite routine. Okay. And, you know, it might be like a 6-day bodybuilding split, or it might be like, you know, 5x5, like you said, or, you know, power, you know, with mostly powerlifting movements. People don't need this. Like, you know, you don't need people to squat, you know, to get them better. Like, you know, if you want to get people, like you said, your grandfather squatting off a chair, sitting up and down off a chair is like, that is exercise, that is movement. You don't need people to be ridiculously jacked to be healthy, but people who are regular exercisers are healthier. Simple as that. They have higher levels of muscle mass, and their muscle quality is also better as well. And it's just from being active regularly. you like, so important. You don't need to be a powerlifter, don't need to be a bodybuilder. You just need to be a regular exerciser. And it has so many benefits for people that like, I don't think I do justice to just how important exercise is for looking after us as we get older. But it is vital. And I think we need to start at where people are with their own level of like physical activity and their own nutrition, dietary habits. And we need to kind of work from there gradually, instead of saying, okay, getting your grandmother and, you know, who does nothing except, you know, gets out of bed and sits in front of the telly every day and just say, okay, granny, today we're doing deadlifts, or, you know, today we're doing clean and jerk. It's not going to work. You know, it's an easy way to kill your granny. So start easy and work from where they are.
Is there like a point where like you would say that the diminishing returns heavily falls off, or we start to see that like curve? So for example, someone could say, well, you know, I don't lift weights or eat protein, and of course they wouldn't be listening to this if that was the case. But is there a point where like someone could just say, well, I'll start lifting or start doing some chair squats when I'm 60 because I don't need to be that strong, or I don't need to have that much muscle, and I just need to maintain function? Or would actually a certain amount of lean body mass, like above average, or actually getting in the gym and say doing like some free weights, is that more beneficial, or you know, what are your kind of thoughts on that? I know it's a very hard question to answer.
Yeah, it is, but like it's relevant as well, and it's very, very hard to quantify that, okay? Because the measures that we have for kind of defining sarcopenia, like we don't even have a consensus measure for it, but we have some measures that are quite widely accepted based on the general population and the lean mass within, specifically the segmental lean mass. So the lean mass, appendicular lean mass, muscle mass in the arms and legs. And basically, if you are below 2 standard deviations below the average of the population, that's classified as sarcopenia. I would say being above average when it comes to muscle mass is of definite benefit, because, you know, when you think about the average of the general population, it's not exactly a particularly high standard. So by doing any kind of activity, you know, you're doing better. If you're doing some resistance exercise, that's fantastic, because that's really what's going to stimulate muscle growth and strength. But, you know, I would try not to focus too much on the specifics until like you get somebody exercising regularly. And if you can get somebody exercising regularly, then you can say, okay, let's kind of focus on, you know, adding in some strength work. But I think strength work is incredibly important. But before that, the most important thing is doing something that people would be able to do regularly. And like, I think it's important to say to people, again, how important it is to do this, to start early, to prevent this from ever becoming a problem, and to kind of maintain, you know, regular exercise levels throughout your life. Because it's those people who are regular exercisers that have stronger immune systems. They've got lower levels of mortality, lower levels of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, all of that.
Yeah, I think like I heard Dr. Andy Galpin talk about it before. He's a sports scientist, I think, in New York, works with some UFC fighters, about comparing like a lot of the research we have with comparing like sick people or people with illness compared to like normal people. But you rarely compare them to or look at people who are, you know, above normal, or, you know, athletes, for example. So it makes sense if you have more lean mass than the average person, you can't get below average until you get to average first. So you have to, it's just a longer cycle. And then if you just think about it from a step back point of view, people who are already active in lifting weights, they have the habits, you know, I'm not, I don't foresee myself at 65 just being like, yep, can't wait to just sit back in the recliner and read the newspaper and then not be active, because it's part of who I am, rather than just saying, oh, thank God I've hit my 100 kilo mark of muscle now. I can just, you know, sit back and watch the sarcopenia. You're like, I'm not going to die from sarcopenia now because I know that something else is going to get me first, you know.
But I think one thing to take into consideration is like the whole concept around muscle memory, and that being that, you know, when you build muscle, your body is basically, if you build muscle and lose it, it's much easier to regain that muscle than it is to gain it in the first place. And we know that muscle memory can last for a few years. And I think that it's just important for people to establish a good baseline when they're young and try and maintain that, than trying to, go from absolutely nothing when they're older, never having exercise in their life, to building muscle. It's still absolutely possible. I just think that person who's been exercising since they were young is going to be in a much better position.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been trying to understand how muscle memory works, and it doesn't seem to be that clear, but it's something to do with like myonuclei domain theory, that you build up a certain amount of myonuclei, and that when the muscle actually shrinks, you still hold on to those or retain them, and then when you lift again, you kind of have those signals. They signal hypertrophy. I don't know what your kind of thoughts are on that, but
yeah, so my own thoughts are similar to that, and I could be completely wrong because it's not my specific area of research. What I have looked into it a bit, and that is it. Like, what you say about myonuclear domain and satellite cells incorporating into muscle. The more satellite cells you have, and you get more satellite cells incorporating into muscle by doing resistance exercise and doing everything that you need to build muscle, they stay there, and they're actually quite long-lived. And even if your muscle size shrinks, if the satellite cells stay there, it makes it a lot easier for those muscles to regain size and strength afterwards. So yeah, you've nailed it on the head. Now, somebody could listen to this and say, oh no, there's new research out and this is saying it's wrong. Then we'll have to accept it, because that research is still very, very much in its early days. And I think there's a huge amount that we need to learn on it. And it'll definitely be interesting whenever new stuff comes out on it.
So as a final question, kind of what advice would you have for somebody who's, let's say, in that age where perhaps sarcopenia would start to come on, or I wouldn't even say sarcopenia, because you're not classified as being in that range unless you're 2 standard deviations below, but in the age of where perhaps we'll start to see some anabolic resistance and they actually want to build muscle, and perhaps they're not overly focused on being able to lift themselves off the toilet just yet, but in 30 years they might be, but they want to still like get jacked, for all means and purposes. Like, they want to look ripped and jacked and more muscular, but they're perhaps a little bit disheartened that you've said that from the ages of 30 or 40 that you're going to start losing some muscle. What advice would you give to those people? What are your kind of advice there for them?
Well, if we take that key kind of outcome of getting jacked as our main outcome, it's like, lift some weights, okay? If you want to build as much muscle as possible, weights, it's going to hold throughout your lifestyle. It's true for young people, it's true for older people, it's true for people in the middle. Lift weights, lift them regularly, eat your protein, rest, recovery, all of those things are important. I would say that for people who are doing it from more of a health perspective point of view, it's really, really important that you find something that you absolutely enjoy and you love doing. So, for example, like you mentioned before we started this, that you play basketball for fun. Somebody goes out and like joins an over 50s football team or something like that. That's absolutely brilliant. Get walking more. Like, make walking part of your daily routine. Like, get up, go for a 30-minute walk in the morning. That is really, really good. Go for a cycle in the morning. Do as much activity as you possibly can. Do more chores in the garden. Like, find something that you can do that you enjoy that will get you moving. And then if you can incorporate resistance exercise, and it can be with weights, it can be with machines, it can be with those elastic bands that people use. Those are actually really commonly used for very older people in nursing homes. Do that and do that regularly. When it comes to the nutrition side of things, make sure that you're getting enough protein, because that does become an issue when people get older. If you look at population levels of protein intake, in general, protein intake is quite low in the population. It's especially low in older people. They're not getting enough protein as much as they should be recommended, and the recommended dose is quite low. And you'll also notice that protein distribution is skewed. So they have like breakfasts that are usually really low in protein. Like if you think of jam and toast or something like that. And then their dinner will have a decent chunk. if you can kind of get people to get a nice chunk of protein at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just 3 times a day, that's a chance for them to stimulate muscle protein synthesis as long as they're exercising frequently too. And then with older people, obviously, like I said, they need a larger chunk of protein. So it may be like 40 grams of protein per meal. That is a decent chunk of protein. So you need to consider what options can we have. So like, most older people don't want to take a protein shake. So like you have to recommend things like high protein yogurts or quarks or skyrs, or if they are willing to take a protein shake, fantastic. They can add that on top of their regular diet. You have to make it as easy a process for these people to kind of to implement into their diet as possible. So that getting that protein in is another way. And then from a supplement perspective, I would say that there are a few that are worth talking about, making sure people are getting enough vitamin D so they're not deficient. And that's just rife in all populations across Europe. If vitamin D deficiency is just ridiculous. But we know it has a major impact on muscle growth. So that can be useful. The same thing goes for omega-3 fish oils, but generally people need higher doses than they usually get. So I'm very, very much like 2 to 3 grams of combined EPA, DHA a day, especially for older people. And it's beneficial for cardiovascular health. It's also beneficial for muscle health. Creatine, absolutely amazing supplement. I think everybody, could potentially benefit from taking, from its cognitive benefits to its muscular benefits, and especially its muscular power output benefits, because that's where older people are really suffering from, is they're not able to generate as much power from the muscle. And that's why we have so many older people who suffer from falls, because they don't have the power to kind of correct themselves if they're falling. And then a last one would potentially be leucine, and that's just to combat the effects of not being able to get as much protein into their diet. So if they can't get enough protein, potentially supplementing meals with leucine could benefit, because that helps to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis response.
Yeah,
off the top of my head.
As we were talking, I was thinking throughout this conversation, I was thinking of like the supplement industry hasn't really got hold of the elderly population. It's a market that they have money, they don't work, they have their pension money, they've got a lot of money. We can market that to them, make a lot of money, make a lot of bank off it. If no, but
I'll come up with my own supplement range after this.
Yeah. In all seriousness, though, I've actually, maybe there is, but I've never seen anything really. And maybe it's that people have that kind of mindset of they couldn't be really bothered when they get older compared to when younger people it sounds bad, but like you're right. I mean, young people do care more about their physical appearance, and whether that's for external reasons or whatever, they're more likely to spend their money on things that are going to, reduce their body fat or make them look better. And ultimately that does have a knock-on effect on health. But actually, this was my final question. The last one was second final. But what's the relationship between testosterone and actual muscle loss? Because I know is there a 1-on-1 correlation between that, or how does that link up with muscle protein breakdown or synthesis? I know that if you testosterone can increase muscle protein synthesis as well. But I remember talking to Carl Dosky a long time ago on the podcast, and I was actually I got my testosterone checked, and it was during my competition prep, and it was really low, but I was still very muscular. So there's obviously not some linear correlation between decreasing in testosterone and muscle loss, because if that was the case, I would have had the same muscle mass as an elderly man, where I was actually quite muscular because I was 3 weeks out from a competition.
So yeah, one thing there is you have to bear in mind is that muscle is accrued slowly over time. So I'm sure you would have accrued that muscle over time, where you were in a bulking phase. You probably had a healthier level of body fat. You were probably eating really, really regularly, taking really, really good care of your health. And yeah, testosterone does drop when you're dieting, but like if you think about it, dieting is going to be a relatively short period, like let's say 6 months or something like that. Your muscle isn't going to fall off in accordance with your testosterone. If it did, you wouldn't have bodybuilding shows. It's just like people would diet down and they would just have a pile of stick figures on stage. That doesn't happen because our body will try and hold on to our muscle as long as we're giving it the right stimuli, which is exercise. But if we look at, there is a correlation between decreasing testosterone levels as we age and decreasing muscle levels as we get older as well. Now, whether it's a one-to-one, I have absolutely no idea. I've never looked into that. But then on the opposite side of the thing, we also know that giving somebody, older people who are lower in testosterone, giving them a testosterone replacement dose helps them to put on muscle gradually over time. But it's not an instant thing. You know, it's not like, oh, your testosterone levels are down for 3 months, your muscle is going to fall off. You're going to hold on to it for a while. But if it's consistently low over a period of years, yeah, that's when somebody's in trouble.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Richie, where can people find more about you? And thanks again for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me. So yeah, if anybody wants to find me, I'm most active on Instagram, and my account is @BMoreNutrition. So that's @B_more_nutrition. I'm on Facebook as well as @BMoreNutrition, and I have a website which is in need of some updating, but it's bmorenutrition.com. And yeah, if ever anybody wants to drop me a question, I'm always happy to speak to them. I try and get through to DMs. I'm also I've been a bit lax with DMs lately just because I'm trying to kind of fit more personal time in and not spend as much time on my phone. But yeah, I usually get back to messages and stuff like that. And always happy to talk to people. So yeah, that's it.
Awesome, man. Thanks so much again.